Hello. We're about to start. Everyone in the back, come on in. I'm going to start by saying I am not Vikram Singh, no matter what it says in your program. Vikram Singh, our fearless leader, is at home dealing with a plumbing emergency. I'd like to come up with a better story, but that's unfortunately what it is. My name is William Wexler, for those who don't know me, and I'm very, very happy to have been called in to do the brief introductions here today. First and foremost because I get to introduce a good friend, Juan Carlos Pinzon, but also because I get to talk very, very briefly just about Colombia, which is something that I have worked on, the issues involving Colombia time to time since the mid-90s. And what I want to just point out is, I was at the Pentagon. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counter-Narcotics at the beginning of this administration, and we had a very senior level visit, and I was briefing the senior level defense official that was going there. And I started my brief with saying, I was there when in the White House when Plan Colombia was first being discussed with the Colombians. And if you went around the table then and you said, at that point, what was the likely outcome? Where would we be in 15 plus years? If anybody gave the scenario that we're in today, they would have been laughed out of the room. The scenario that we are in is so much more positive than any scenario that we from afar could have imagined at the time. And there's a real lesson in that. The most important lesson is the dedication of the Colombian people and the leadership of Colombian senior officials. And we have with us somebody who is perfectly positioned, perhaps more than anybody else, to tell the story about how that transition was made to a place where the FARC controlled every place in Colombia with the exception of Bogota and Bogota by night, to a place where the FARC is a shadow of what it is today. And most importantly, truly inspirational peace talks are likely to conclude soon, I hope, to end the longest running internal armed conflict in the Western Hemisphere. And Colombia has become, through this process, a real partner of the United States. This isn't something that the United States just gives to Colombia. Colombia gives tremendously to the United States and is an exporter of security in the hemisphere and indeed around the world. It's a tremendous story, and again, Ambassador Pinzon will talk to you about it today. Before serving as defense minister, Ambassador Pinzon was chief of staff to the President Santos. I first met him when he was on his way to Princeton, and he was also vice minister of defense under Uribe previous to that. You have a real treat here today because in addition to hearing from Juan Pinzon, you're going to hear from two people who, far more than I, were central to the Washington side of this story over the last decade. Two Dans, two senior directors at the National Security Council and special assistants to the president in charge of the Western Hemisphere, and two people who are wearing almost the identical outfit today. So it's hard to tell them apart. But Dan Fisk is the chief operations officer for IRI, having joined in 2009 after the end of the Bush administration, and also in the Bush administration was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hem Affairs. Prior to that, he had a long series of very impressive positions on both the Senate and the House side. So he'll also be able to talk about how important the Congress played in this role, and in particular the Republican side of the aisle in this effort. Dan Restrepo is a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress. He was special assistant to the president, again, and senior director for Western Hem Affairs for 6 years in the Obama administration. He was more than what that title says. I know as someone who worked with him, in many ways for him, he was really the person that was in charge of Latin American policy, making it, organizing it, coordinating it, speaking to the president, speaking for the president, for everybody in the administration. When Dan spoke, we all listened. So with that, I would like to introduce you all to listen to what they have to say, because this is one of the lessons that I think you'll hear is when we think about why this has been a success. One of the reasons from the American perspective, it's been a success because it's been bipartisan. It's been a success because this has been a common policy that has been pushed through both Republican and Democratic administration, both the executive and the legislative branch, and that's what we see here today as well. So thank you very much. Ambassador Pinzon, to you. Thank you, please.
Well, good morning, all. First, I want to thank my three friends here today, Will, Dan, and Dan. These people that has been substantial to the transformation of Colombia, and they represent exactly what you mentioned at the end of your remarks, bipartisanship. We have strong Republican support, we have a strong Democratic support, we have a strong U.S. support. And I think that has allowed several administrations in Colombia as well, different presidents, different types of leadership, but at the end, all of them committed with the future of Colombia to perform, to move forward, and to lead this interesting case that Colombia represents as of today. I'm very aware at the same time of the new bipartisan tie that they have. You know, they don't, you'll see in a second. They don't have any more blue or red or blue, but they use now purple. That's what they use, you know. So I hope that's the bipartisan party, you know, which makes sense to have these days. Happy to see so many friends here. I see so many familiar faces, good friends, friends of Colombia, personal friends. Happy to see you all. Thank you for coming. And thank you for giving me the opportunity today to offer some remarks on what has happened in Colombia in recent times, particularly to update you on what is going on as we speak, and at the same time to prepare ourselves to a very important event, which implies the presidential visit. President Santos is coming to town. He's coming on an official invitation by President Obama, which I think is very relevant because what we're coming for is to celebrate precisely a U.S. policy, but at the same time, the efforts and the success of the Colombian people, of the Colombian armed forces, and the transformation of Colombia with the U.S. support. At the same time, how to look to the future, because we got to look very much to the past to inspire us, to see what happened, to learn, to take lessons, to understand that we did good things, but to understand that still we have many challenges. And those challenges need to be tackled, need to be confronted, and we expect to continue to have the United States as the best possible partner for the next phase for Colombia. Let me start just to remind you, but I know we're talking about among experts, to remind you how Colombia looked like 15 years ago. In the economic front, in the social front, the security front. Let me start by security. 15 years ago, Colombia was the most violent country in the planet. It was not in the region, it was in the world. Cities like Medellin, a beautiful place these days, was considered the most violent city in the world. That was a little bit of the perspective of what we had in Colombia. So the implications for the Colombian people were dramatic. We had the highest homicide rate in the world, the highest number of kidnapping in the world. Around 30% of our country in the southeastern part of the nation was somehow controlled or with presence from FARC and ELN. In the 30% of the north, mainly with presence or controlled by paramilitary. And main cities, of course, with presence of the state, but all the time with the risk of receiving some kind of attack, some kind of threat from any of these actors. That was the reality at that time. When I describe this myself, sometimes it's even hard for me to think that that's what we had. When you think on today's reality, it's very hard to imagine how it happened. But that was we had. That was what we had. On the economic front, the country was really suffering a very difficult time. The economy, by 1999 and 2000, for the first time, had a decrease in economic growth of minus 4.5, minus 4.7% of GDP. The first time in 70 years. Investment was only 12% of GDP. Unemployment reached 21%. And most of the employment that was created was informal rather than formal employment. So all this was, the perfect storm to social conflict, to poverty, and to somehow deteriorate the conditions of life in the country. When you think about social indicators, the Gini coefficient was almost 0.6. The poverty line was around 52%. 52% of total population was below poverty line. And something like 28% of total population was on the extreme poverty line. That was that picture of Colombia 15 years ago. So this is why, first, and I will keep doing this, I will honor always the soldiers of Colombia, the policemen of Colombia, brave people from Colombia, people in general, that first of all was very resilient to this, because still on that scenario, the country was trying to move forward. And then, with a strong leadership, with a strong decision making, the country was able to start to make progress, to confront and tackle all these challenges, and to change that reality. Why we appreciate the United States support more than people think, and more than, the common knowledge in the country, in the United States, will talk about. Because the U.S. was that friend that came to Colombia, I don't have any doubt, with its own interests related to drug trafficking, interests related to regional stability, but at the end, interests that we share, friendship, decision-making. It started with a Democratic administration with a Republican majority in Congress. Later on, we had a Republican administration with a majority in the Democratic Party in Congress. And as of today, still we have a Democratic administration with a majority of the Republican Party in Congress. That's the kind of settlement we have had. And the good news is that all the time we have seen support, of course, with different tones and colors. Sometimes the idea of promoting strong national security perspective has come as first point in line. Some other times the issues of human rights or institutions or development or poverty or business or job creation, at the end, a whole package of discussion. But that has been very useful for Colombian policymakers to, on one hand, keep a strong vision on what needs to be done in the future. Second, to raise the standards. Third, to enhance Colombian institutions. And somehow to enable our national capabilities and national institutional capacity to confront the different challenges. This is why we appreciate very much the U.S. support. I have to tell, U.S. support has never been the same way that you might see it in other places. So it's not a U.S.-led effort. It's not a U.S. funding effort, but it's a U.S. support effort. And I think that's very important to identify. Has been mainly Colombians who have paid for its efforts. Colombian taxpayers are the ones who have been paying for 95% of the total effort we have done. It's Colombian soldiers, policemen, and justice who has confronted crime, terrorism, and crime. And it's Colombian institutions and leadership that has performed this process of policy making in the country. I think that's very important. But this is why we value even this more, because we have not been dictated what to do. We have been supported to move forward. And I think it's a very important bottom line on what has happened in Colombia. I gave you the picture of what we had 15 years ago. I'm going to give you the picture of what we have today. On the security front, just to give you one idea, homicide rate by 2015 is the lowest in 35 years. According to some, might be on 40 years, but I'm sure that 35 years because it's since the time we really have records. Kidnapping numbers are the lowest in the past 13 years. And I can tell you that the problems in security that we discussed today are not anymore threats to the existence of Colombian state or to the nation or to the future of the country, but very specific crime activities. And mainly, Colombian citizens will express their frustration in security on issues like street crime rather than any other issue. So not so much different from what happens here in a city like Washington, D.C., what people care is on their own security to, have a life. That's the kind of change we have seen. The consequence in the economy has been very impressive. In the past 6 years, Colombia has been able to have an economic growth in average of 4.5% of GDP, which outperforms most of the countries in the Western Hemisphere. And when you look year 2014 and year 2015, Colombia overperformed every country in the Western Hemisphere and many countries in the world. I think that's important. Then Colombia has become an attractive destiny for foreign investment and for Colombian investment. Colombians have returned investment to the country, and foreign direct investment has come back to the country. By 2014, we had a record year of $16 billion in foreign direct investment. That's, frankly speaking, for U.S. standards, a limited amount of money. For Colombian standards, is, let me tell you, the highest ever we have got. Unemployment has been reduced in a substantial way. The past 5 years, we have had one single digit unemployment. And this is very important because it means it's less people going to the streets to look for jobs. It means more people going to schools to get education. And somehow it pacifies the will of the nation, and somehow allows the nation to mature and to become more civilized in terms of denying the use of violence. Maybe that is very helpful to the security numbers at the same time. It's part of one same system that somehow gets feet on one side or the other. The most important thing is that the advance in security has strong advance and progress in the economy. But more important than that, it has consequence in the life of Colombians, particularly the poorest Colombians. So we have cut poverty by more than half in 10 years. As we speak, we only have now, which still is a big number, 28% of Colombians below the poverty line. But now only less than 10% of Colombians below the extreme poverty line. See what dramatic change we have had from what we have to where are we today. In addition to that, I think that it's important to know that I explained Gini coefficient at 0.6 is almost reaching 0.4, which implies that inequality is closing its gap as well, which I believe is very important vis-a-vis the vision of a more secure country in the years to come. I think that has been this transformation, and that is a little bit of the evidence. Let me end my remarks getting into the specifics of FARC and peace process and the future of Colombia. First, let me remind you that the peace process is not an alternative strategy to what we have been doing. It's just the consequence of our national security strategy and of the efforts of the past 15 years. We are not into this because suddenly we decide that we will not continue to move forward and get stagnant, but it's the consequence of permanent progress in degrading the threats to the Colombian people. FARC today is 30% of what it was 15 years ago. For counterinsurgency standards and counterinsurgency warfare, those who are experts on that field will easily come to the idea that counterinsurgency wars are not won with the idea of killing the last insurgent or with the idea of controlling a territory on permanent basis, on conquering. It's exactly a more complex scenario. It's in a scenario in which victory looks like denying those who are in arms using terrorism, denying two things. First, the possibility of reaching any objective by the use of terror and the use of weapons. So that is a thing that has happened in Colombia already. And second, denying them the possibility of somehow getting any kind of political advantage as consequence of their doings. Let me remind you, in Colombia, 96% of Colombians will think that the use of violence, the use of terrorism, or those who use that are considered or are suspected to have a negative consideration out of Colombian people. So that is a fact, that is a reality. And then when you compare what has happened to the leadership of the FARC, what has happened to their capabilities, what has happened to their funding capabilities, the reality is that it has been degraded to a point that never before was degraded. To put this a little bit on my former language as Minister of Defense, I can tell you that FARC in the past 5 years lost the top commander, the top military commander, and 60 other leaders of different levels in their structure. That is something that is not so easy to see on any other kind of security campaign as the one we had in Colombia. Then peace comes, and peace process and peace talks comes as the option that the president has, that has led himself to end the conflict, to shorten the time of this conflict. To those who ask, would Colombia be able to anyway get to peace without doing a peace process? Maybe so. There are the capabilities, but that will take more time, more blood, more efforts, more resources, and the return for Colombian people every day is less than it used to be. And the reason is that now these organizations are located in the marginal areas of Colombia. They used to be located in almost 60% of the Colombian municipalities. They are now located at 8% of Colombian municipalities. So that explains why the intention of looking for a fair peace agreement is what is going on. For that peace agreement, President Santos established 4 red lines, which I think he has complied. The first one, he decided not to negotiate the economic model or the political system. That was very important. The second one, he decided not to negotiate the future of the armed forces with the FARC or any other criminal organization. That was very important for Colombia too. It is, in fact. The third one, he decided not to grant any permanent ceasefire until the agreements are set. He has managed the use of force, as any commander-in-chief does, as will happen in this country, but he has not renounced to the use of force against crime or against different expressions of violence. And fourth, he has committed to the idea that there will be no impunity in the cases of war crimes or crimes against humanity. I think that is very important, and that has implied the development of a whole set, a complex one, but a set of transitional justice, looking towards keep international standards on that front. I can't talk forever, and my friends know that, but I wanted to summarize a bit of what is this transformation of Colombia, what has been somehow part of the role of the United States of America on this, why we thank the United States of America, and by the way, how much we have progress, how much we are getting into a new phase, but how much we need to continue to get the support in a bipartisan way of the United States. The United States was our partner to bring security and to pacify the country. We need the United States to be the partner in peacetime that help us to care for that peace and help us to really take over the potentials of Colombia for the good of Colombia, for the good of the region, but somehow for the good of this wonderful partnership we have created. Thank you very much.
Through the marvels of technology, I think my microphone is on. Yes, excellent. Well, thank you all again for being here. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. As the Ambassador and as Will pointed out, Dan and I, without coordinating, managed to dress identically today.
The purple party.
Exactly. What are the chances? And first of all, it's an honor to share the stage with both of these gentlemen. I've known them. I've actually known Dan longer. We worked together on the Hill more than 20 years ago.
That's right. We're both 12 years old.
Right, exactly. We were child prodigies at the time. But I will still defer to my elder and allow you to ask the first question. And we're going to ask a couple questions, have a conversation, and then turn it over to all of you. So,
Great. Well,
go ahead,
thank
Dan.
Dan and the Center for American Progress, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Let me do the obligatory Washington thing. These are my own views, not IRI. Sorry. I also have to notice this Dan sitting to my right. So that just shows you how
Right, exactly.
perspectives change. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for your comments. Thanks for your service, by the way, in several capacities. And you're an example, I think, very much of the Colombian, your own country, and your citizens' commitment to the well-being of their own country. And I think you exemplify that in a way that merits commendation from all of us on this. Let me, if I can, start with the question you mentioned about the degradation of the FARC. Completely agree with that. But it's also a different institution. You made reference to counterinsurgency doctrine. It's not a counterinsurgency, it's a criminal organization. And as we know, you can kill counterinsurgents and their leadership, but criminal organizations reproduce in different ways. You also have an organization which, according to Colombian estimates, earn about $3.5 billion a year off of those criminal activities. So there's several challenges that confront this process moving forward. I guess my question is there's a perception among some of us in Washington that when we look at the negotiations, we don't see a Colombian government acting in terms of its negotiating from strength. We understand wanting to be magnanimous in certain regards, because in a way there's victory on the horizon. But on the other hand, it looks like there's all give by the Colombian government. And the winners of this are going to be potentially the FARC in terms of the standards they're held to with what about their abuses? And again, goes back to of human rights. What about their criminal activities? Those kind of things. So how would you address that to those of in Washington who at this point do have some questions?
Well, thank you. And I have the Republican at my left and the Democrat at my right, just to point it out. Well, I think your questions are very important, and I know there are people who has that kind of concern, which is very valid and a one that I would respect very much. I think the President's strategy has been very much to really move in a way that guarantees that at the end we will succeed on ending the conflict. By doing that, he has used a strategy to give some kind of dignity to the opponent and give them some space to understand that they have an exit window. That will be a little bit of the narrative that I will bring out of this. But on the other hand, I believe we need to look at this from a strategic perspective on how this has been crafted. And second, we need to give time to see what comes exactly at the end. And for the first part, I would say that when the key things were ruled out of the table, we are telling, yes, we are ready to look even pragmatic on some issues, but there's no way we will discuss on certain issues. When you think about other peace processes, even in the region, some of these processes really were about discussing the future of the economy, discussing the future of property, discussing the future of the armed forces, how to reduce them, how to even eliminate the strength of police in some of these countries. Or in other cases that I've seen in processes in Africa, what they have done is a model of sharing power, in which states decide how to divide power with the criminal group that they're confronting. Any of that is happening in Colombia. I think that should be, from a strategic perspective, the most important view to the Colombia case. So it looks very much like Colombian government has been able to have the strength coming out of military strength and victory, if you want, to precisely rule out many of these issues of the table. But there are others that I have to tell are part of discussion and negotiation. So I will look at strength more from what was ruled out than from what is being discussed. Now, from what is being discussed, still we need to see what comes at the end.
We'll undoubtedly get questions from the audience on some of the details of what's being discussed at the table and what has come out at this point. But I want to actually jump forward for a moment to a March 24th question. Right? March 23rd is the currently understood deadline for the talks. So the day after, and one of the concerns that others in Washington share, actually I think some of these are shared concerns, is the capacity of the Colombian state to deal with life after the Accords. One of the things that has changed inexorably over the course of the last 15 years is the capacity of the security institutions in Colombia. You and I have discussed this on a number of occasions, both in officialdom and outside of officialdom, in terms of how much more capable Colombia is today of projecting itself, its security apparatus, into any portion of Colombia. The rest of the Colombian government is an open question as to its ability to be present elsewhere in the territory and to consolidate the gains that have been made both on the battlefield but also in an accord, whatever that accord ends up looking like. How ready is Colombia institutionally for March 24th?
I think that's a very good question. Anyone who follows Colombia will recognize this wonderful transformation that I described, but will recognize at the same time the challenges we have. And I think you are pointing out precisely on those challenges. How effective the country can be and needs to be on taking institutions to that 8% of municipalities, around 150 municipalities, that is still required to be integrated into the rest of the country. And I think that's a very important challenge. I believe for that there are some interesting things happening. First was the strong decision of the president to create a post-conflict ministry, which is focused on planning precisely that. I think he appointed a very serious and respected person, a former Minister of Defense, a very well-regarded politician, somehow an important leader that is entering onto that discussion. I hope he can be practical and successful. Second, I think a good heritage that the efforts of these years will leave for Colombia for a while is the development of a strong military capability that can be used, as we use it for practical maneuvering against terrorism, now can be used in part, to deploy the rest of the state in those areas. I'm probably thinking even on the helicopter capability and on the military engineers and others that are already there and that are tools that can be used as part of that post-conflict planning. Thirdly, I would say that when I mention how much we feel happy and committed about what the United States did for Colombia in these years, but how much will be important to sustain support so we can sustain and guarantee peace. That's really what we were thinking. Unfortunately, success in this kind of situation is not a thing that you get in 1 year, 5 years, or even in 15. We can tell in the case of Colombia that in 15 years we transformed the country. But if we want to sustain this effort, we need another 10-year effort to really integrate these regions and these areas. And here's where certainly Colombian budget will play a role, Colombian planning will play a role, but international support can make a difference. And I think that we need to, package that vision in a way that is in benefit on those, all of us, people like you and others that have confronted and been able to help the change in Colombia. I think that's the real model that we should look at.
Building off Dan, I'm going to look backwards in a moment because this is the other part of the challenge that we've seen with these processes, which is the need for accountability and across the society. And some of this has been, some of this is addressed under the rubric of transitional justice, but I think it's simply justice, regardless of kind of what word you put in front of that one. And so in terms of that mechanism of trying to ensure that Colombians across the country have accountability for what's happened over the past more than 15 years, so that there is a realization that those who really did, you made reference to war crimes, those that committed war crimes, have been dealt with in some way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be harsh or penal, but in terms of, again, some mechanism there. But also there, I think, a threshold below war crimes on that. And in terms of the one concept I would put out there is, while there's been a lot of focus, especially from Washington, again, you mentioned this about the focus on human rights, mostly in terms of Colombian governmental treatment of its citizens and specifically the military and police, is I go back to the basic, which we've talked about before, which is if you're Colombian and you were killed by the FARC, you were maimed by the FARC, you're just as dead, you're just as maimed. And those people deserve accountability as well as those that may have been caught in circumstances in which Colombian officials or Colombian military are involved. So what is President Santos and the Colombian government's view in terms of how to make sure that there's some accountability that is equitable in terms of its treatment for all those who have perished or been affected by this, and actually for their survivors who will want the answers?
I think the first point that Colombians should look at, and this will be a little bit my own personal take, as many other Colombians, beyond my public capacities, I'm a Colombian citizen, and I've been, like many other Colombians, in part, seen somehow a victim, like many others, from what terrorism and crime has done to Colombia. So from that standpoint of view, the first thing I will tell is, I think the FARC are not coming out of this conflict without harm. Exactly on the contrary. I mean, the Colombian state has been able to punish them in a strong way and with a strong hand on sustained and permanent basis in the past 15 years. And they have seen most of the leadership fade away, thousands of demobilized going out of their group, and really after controlling territories and looking like kingpins, really, running in the middle of the jungle. So that is a thing that Colombians need to know and need to understand, to see the current reality. Second, since we're moving into a situation in which now is a political agreement, what should create the end and final game once and for all, is necessary, and I think that has been the discussion among the government, to create the incentives for these people to, instead of waiting for the armed forces to get them, because they will get them anyway, sooner or later, Well, you need to create incentives for them to come first, save time, save resources, save lives, deliver the weapons, and find a way to integrate into society. And in order to do that, here's where justice is a challenge. And here's where the government of Colombia, in its discussion, is developing, designing this model of transitional justice. Transitional justice, as everybody knows, beyond Colombia, this is not the only country in which it has happened, not the first time that has happened in Colombia. Some other models have happened in the past. Probably Colombia is trying to learn from others and try to do something like a little bit more state-of-the-art to what is available. But the idea at the end is to create a system in which those who commit war crimes or crimes against humanity will go to a tribunal, will need to tell the truth in order to get benefits, and they will have to guarantee non-repetition. In order to create incentives, instead of offering jail, what they will get offer is restriction of freedom and reparatory activities like demining, like eradicating crops, like doing other things. As a citizen of Colombia, not as ambassador, sure, I would like to see these persons many, many years in jail, as most of Colombians would like. But the dilemma is, if we do that, simply we will have to go after them and do what we have to do with the consequence that we know. Or we go for this and we look for national reconciliation in the years to come. But of course, it matters very much how the system works. I think President Santos is committed since day one with this idea of no impunity in war crimes and on trying to design a model that is credible and feasible. I think those who are skeptic are valuable comments these days. I have seen some of them. I saw my friend Jose Miguel here. And I think those are valuable comments. Skepticism is necessary right now so Colombian government can make its best effort, and I think they are doing that, to try to tackle part of these situations. Now, the other part are what are considered agents of the state. This is not the first time we have a peace process. This is the sixth time we have a demobilized organized group. Every president in the past, I would say 30 years, has been in the middle of a negotiation or has demobilized any kind of criminal or terrorist organization. And the question now, and the debate is that why in those times never state agents got any option or any alternative. So what the government has decided, without discussing this with the FARC, but as a sovereign decision, is that we'll grant access to state agents that commit crimes as part of the conflict to a model of transitional justice. What is the government looking? Reconciliation at the end. What cannot happen is that one side that was powerful criminal activity get whatever the transitional justice process offer, and the other side just goes to an ordinary system. So that is what the government is offering. Now, a very important part here is truth, reparation to the victims, and non-repetition. I think there are two final messages here. One, if someone fails to that, can go to jail behind bars for 20 years. Second, members of or state agents that committed crimes and get into this process will go into a system that will have higher standards than the others. So the model is similar, but not identical.
Two very quick housekeeping matters. So I'm about to turn it over to you all after I ask a question. So go ahead thinking of your questions in the form of questions. And then a warning to the folks staffing the event that we're probably going to run a little bit longer than we were billed for. And for fear of complicating your life unnecessarily, Mr. Ambassador, particularly as you have a presidential visit bearing down on you, and it was alluded to in your comments a second ago, there is not political unanimity in Colombia today about where Colombia finds itself, and particularly in the context of the negotiation or the discussions with the FARC. How big a challenge are political divisions in Colombia today, both to reaching an agreement before March 23rd or thereabouts, and then going forward into that into March 24th and beyond. How big a challenge are the political differences that exist in the country today?
Allow me to respond to that with a joke. I thought they were very big until I came to the United States. And so what is real polarization, you know? So
Well played.
you know, polarized societies are part of democracy, and I think I would even see it as from the outside as a positive story. We have check and balances in Colombia. We have different opinions, and we have people that is willing to provide to the discussion. Of course, in my case personally, I would love to see all the leaders that have contributed to the transformation of Colombia always in the same page. I wish, but as you know, it's hard in politics to see that in Colombia or here in America or wherever you want to look at this. But hopefully, this democratic debate that we have in Colombia right now should bring more consensus as much as some of the ideas that opposition on one side or the other are offering, and those can be somehow included in the discussion and in the future of Colombia. I would feel more comfortable about that, and I think that is an effort that President Santos is trying to make happen. Getting on more details about that is a little bit of getting in the kitchen, and I think it's part of life, it's part of democracy.
We'll keep you out of the kitchen. Dan, you're not off the hook because we're going to ask follow-ups. So we're going to turn it over to folks. A microphone will come to you. Ask two things. One, identify yourself, and the second is questions in the form of questions.
I'm Steve Vetter, President of Partners of the Americas, and Mr. Ambassador, thank you for that wonderful summary. This is actually a question for the two Dans, with comment from you. Having been created 50 years ago by John Kennedy to create partnerships at the civil society level, we've also kept our eye on how do you build enduring partnerships in a highly polarized age and era. The story of Colombia, creating a bipartisan support that has endured, is simply remarkable. So the first question is, could you give us more background from your point of view on how that actually happened? When you look at the post-peace process, where the partnership is going to be tested and is even as important, what factors do you see at play, both in the United States and in Colombia, that will allow it to sustain itself?
Question was for you, Dan.
I'll defer to you, Dan, and then a couple of thoughts.
Well, I think you've asked from the U.S. perspective in particular the key question in terms of how to sustain this. I mean, there's been this unique constellation politically, has been alluded to here, also within, for all due respect, being now part of the chattering class, with the chattering class in Washington as well. And I think going forward, I think this is where the polarization in Washington that exists now, and I'm not necessarily going to call it I shouldn't call it polarization, it's just the struggle between two worldviews, two different philosophies, is really going to be tested in terms of where the majority in the two respective parties are at this point in terms of how they see the U.S. should be engaging in the world. I think that the key from my perspective is that all of us need to do work, and this isn't partisan or on any philosophical foundation, need to do the work to point out to what extent Colombia has been a success, because we have to educate a new group of American leaders on a fairly regular basis, about every 2 years, at least to some degree, part of our process, and that there needs to continue to be success, because I think that's actually what's happened here, is that the idea that political capital is finite may have some truth in it, but on the other hand, the aspects of that continue to be, that political capital continues to be able to wield returns based on success. And I think after actually Dan's question, what happens on March 24th is one of the critical ones, because if we see Colombia unsure of where it's going in its future, we see a reintegration process that look like some others around the world that have not been. You learn the negative lessons from the what not to do. I think that's going to have the ramifications here in terms of sustaining the American commitment.
Right.
I mean, it's a little bit off of in some ways, but.
And I agree with pretty much everything Dan just said, in the sense that, because I don't think at a fundamental level, the debate about the U.S.'s place in the world and how we engage with the world is particularly a partisan debate. You can find that debate within both partisan entities in the United States today, and how that plays itself out and the worldview that prevails there will matter to the U.S. Colombia partnership and, again, to the United States' place in the world. I think success begets success. In the sense that it has been easy, and I think for a very interesting reason, and I think this is the fundamental thing. Because Colombia met with initial success, it was easier, and this was a relatively small U.S. investment. Right? Particularly if you think of it in the course of the kinds of investments the United States has made over the course of the last 15 years elsewhere in the world. Right? This is a week worth of investment in other parts of the world. That the United States has made over the course of 15 years. And that's only possible, and it was only successful because Colombia was participating in the manner in which it was participating, right? I think one of the things that in Washington we love to put ourselves in the center of narratives. Washington does not belong in the center of this narrative. The Colombian people, Colombia's leaders, the folks who sacrificed in every sense of the word to build the Colombia that they have today, is why Colombia worked. And that's one of the things, and political tension is a beautiful thing, and it's an important part of the process, and I agree with you, Mr. Ambassador, on that front, that there continue to be enough of a consensus in Colombia about a way forward, so that you have that Colombian commitment, I think, is fundamentally important also. And if those pieces are in place, a sustained U.S. commitment is vitally important as a catalyst, as it was as an initial matter, because we're not talking about big dollars. I mean, yes, they're big dollars. We're talking, over a course of time, billions of dollars. But again, as compared to other U.S. investments elsewhere in the world, the return on investment for the dollars spent with our Colombian partners is incomparable. And being able to maintain that dynamic, I think, is part of the reason it's been successful to date, and how you maintain success moving forward.
If I can, I'm sorry, I want to echo one of Dan's comments about the consensus, or say of the discussion in Colombia being within certain parameters. I do think that in the case of Colombia, that is an interesting dynamic in itself right now, given that there is a very vocal constituency that is expressed its opposition, skepticism towards, I'm not sure what the right word is, I guess it depends, but we've not had that over the last 15 years. There's largely been at least an elite Colombian consensus that was conveyed to Washington as well, that reinforced. I think that's an important point.
Maybe I should comment a little bit from what I hear from these two American perspectives, which I would follow the next idea. There are not so many cases that you can identify in the world in which this kind of progress has happened. So yes, you can think that this could be done better. Yes, you can add a little bit to this process. But when you look the picture of this case relative to other conflicts, or even relative to other current events in Latin America, I think this is a case that should be continue to be somehow empowered and supported. And that will be a little bit of the encouragement I will bring to those who like to think on these issues. If you are being successful, don't run from success. Keep pushing success, because then you will get a little bit much alike of what you would like to see. If you run from it, you might leave things in the middle. That's one part. Or the other part, things can move backwards instead of moving forward. What I believe is a big lesson from what we have tried in Colombia, and I keep telling this to my fellow Colombians and particularly to teams that I've been working with, is that despite our progress and our success, there's only one clear thing we need to do tomorrow: work hard. And that's the thing we will need to do for the next generation. Work very hard to make this worth. Those who have contributed to where we are today need and should reclaim all the recognition. But those of us who need to work the next 10, 15 years will need to work very hard to earn our own space. That will be a little bit of my own approach onto this. It's up to Colombia, but it's good to have good partners and good people like the U.S. on our backing.
End of the second row. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Lydia DeBose, and I work for Catholic Relief Services. A very interesting conversation this morning. Thank you. My question is if any of you or all of you would like to comment a little bit about the role of the Catholic Church in Colombia in the peace process, and moving forward, what organizations like ours, like Catholic Relief Services, can do to help in this next phase in terms of sustainable economic development initiatives, work in the rural area particularly. Thank you.
Well, Catholic Church is always important in Colombia, no doubt. Has been always a big contributor to social efforts. Has been very important to contribute to pacify different parts and different regions. Have been very relevant on education, specifically on those marginal communities. They have been very important. And I think there's a big role for them to continue to be played. And at the same time, when you think about the Catholic leadership, nobody can put aside the Pope. Pope Francis, Papa Francisco, is a very important world figure, a very important Latin American figure, and no doubt, I'm sure he is an inspiring figure as well to keep moving forward in Colombia. So I think it's a very, very, very important role and space.
Apparently, only people on this side of the room have questions.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this really good presentation. My name is Brian Finnegan. I'm with the AFL-CIO, and I wanted to build a question based on the comment of the ambassador about looking toward the future but recognizing the past, the good and the bad, and the comment by Dan Restrepo about the presence of the state. Specifically, the question is, what plans going forward are there to change certain things about the presence of the state for workers? Because again and again, over these same 15 years, what we've seen, aside from other problems I could get into, we've seen the first presence of the state is the riot police and the army to basically deal with any worker mobilization. And this has led to serious physical harm and repression of rights. And it's not just the labor movement. The Afro-Colombian, environmental, all kinds of civil society suffers from something that doesn't look like post-conflict. So what does the post-conflict look like for civil society, labor, Afro-Colombians? Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I think it's a very valid question, but first I would like to give some context. I believe that the kind of armed forces capabilities and qualifications of today as compared to a decade or 2 decades ago are quite different. We have today armed forces that are basically the most educated on human rights than any other, and I would even challenge some of the advanced countries on at least on the training process. And of course there are cases, but those cases immediately are prosecuted. Misbehavior is not tolerated in the Colombian armed forces, and that kind of misbehavior immediately gets proceed into both military specialized justice or ordinary justice, depending on the kind of crime. So I think that's a very important issue. Second, on labor rights, I think that Colombia is one of these countries that certainly has made more progress in the past decade. On one hand, on increasing the protection of labor leaders. I think there's no other country that will have an agency just dedicated to provide security to human rights activists or members of unions that will come with a case against their own security. Immediately that agency is expected to provide any kind of security and service. So I think that context leaves us to look a little bit ahead. Some of the things we expect in the years to come, on one hand, is that issues like the free trade agreement, in which, by the way, was a thing that we appreciate very much because it has allowed to create more jobs, it has allowed to create more investment and more opportunity, somehow will continue to increase using the labor standards that were set there, an increasing process of growing formal workers and more stable and more clear benefits for those who have unemployment. On the other side, I think that it will be very important to see that even those who have promoted the idea of multiple use of tools, to create activism, also will get unsettled as part of the peace process and as part of the stabilization of the country and stop using some kind of behavior under activism. I think that as more rational it can be, the better for all. So that will be a little bit my expectation. But what I can tell is that those who are in need of security can claim it and will get it. And second, that human rights continues to be a very important element of the process of evolution in Colombia.
Giving that side of the room an opportunity. Anybody on that side of the room? Dan Fisk is intimidating people to the point that they don't even want to ask a question. Right here, second row.
Hello, my name is Jose Miguel Pulido. I'm a public affairs advisor at Mitsui & Co. Thank you very much for all of your comments. This one's primarily for Ambassador Pinzon. Now, after March 23rd, there's a lot of concern that perhaps portions of the FARC will sort of dismantle themselves and then become part of sort of smaller organized crime groups, perhaps engage in illegal mining or other activity. What has the government looked into to sort of prevent smaller former FARCers to engage in that sort of work? Thank you.
It's a good question. It has happened in the past. As I said, Colombia demobilization process, the FARC one will not be the first. We have seen that in the past with the AUC, with the M19, with EPL and others. And sure, one can expect beyond hopes. Ideal hope is to see everybody behaving and, stop using violence as a tool, stop using crime as a tool. That's what the peace process is all about, is looking to guarantees that these people will not come back to crime. But assuming it can happen, and history is there to tell, this is why the Colombian government has decided to enter in a process of modernization and of somehow continue to have a stance for its armed forces to guarantee security and to guarantee the possibility of fighting organized crime as a key element of Colombian security and peacekeeping, if you can tell.
One hand, and then I think I'm going to give Dan the option of asking the last question after this one. So, and then the ambassador staff is starting to look at me like I'm keeping him a little too long.
Thank you. David Stein with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. You each mentioned how relatively small the U.S. investment was in Plan Colombia. My question is, given that, why was that U.S. investment so necessary, particularly when it comes to economic development?
It was actually what I think, and as lessons that I believe experts will get to study in the years to come. Because I think this will lead to an interesting process of thinking from academia and different experts. But I think one of the good things that happened with the U.S. resources was that they were not scattered, but very focused. That was the first thing. So instead of putting money on many, many things that at the end were not easy to measure, we're very much focused on very specific things. And those things were measured and were based on issues that the U.S. had some kind of technological advantage, organizational advantage. So I'm going to mention technology. So technology for air mobility, So U.S. have good frames for that. Technology for intelligence, U.S. has a very advanced capabilities onto that. Or organizational techniques and procedures like human rights, like training and professionalization of the armed forces. And when you go to economic development, somehow the capacity of the United States agencies to really be able to focus on a very specific area and create a shock that offers some kind of basic services that somehow create a practical solution for the people that was demanding that kind of support. So I think that will be a little bit of a lessons learned that I believe needs to be discussed and needs to get in depth in the year to come to see how these can apply in other cases, or how do we continue in Colombia.
So off of that, Mr. Ambassador, let me do this as a closing question. March 24th, let's say there's an agreement. What should that focus be by the United States in terms of where it directs its resources and expertise, given where Colombia is today in terms of its own capabilities and capacities, which are far different than they were 15 years ago?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that first is that Colombia needs to focus itself, and sure we will do it, and we'll need to do that, and we will need to use our national budget and our national resources to assure that the planning that has been done can really be able to advance. Sure, we are in the middle, as the world is, a little bit of a slowdown. We might not be in the best condition of other years, but I think planning is critical and mobilizing resources is critical. By saying that, I think that, again, U.S. support is important. The central effort needs to be Colombian, but that U.S. support should be focused on, first, assuring that these marginal areas is not the country, is not the whole country, that these very marginal areas that are entering post-conflict really receive development support for those areas. The possibility of developing agricultural products in those areas, so the agricultural potential really commits those farmers and peasants and really allow them to have a different life. And I continue to see the importance of guaranteeing funding for the fight against organized crime, not only in Colombia but in the region. Let's remind ourselves that Colombia today trains more than 5,000 members of police and military out of the whole Western Hemisphere. And I think that's a very important tool that we work together, and I believe it's important to continue to support that. But there are other programs that are important in these areas, like education programs. I strongly believe that partnerships on that front can be substantial, can somehow have a very long-term consequence and short-term benefit for the good of the United States and Colombia. So I see that there are many areas of opportunity. Demining could be another area. Supporting those soldiers and police who got wounded and that require some kind of additional technological progress on them could be another space for the U.S. to play a role. And I think there's, to end, a very important national security partnership that we share for the good of the region, for the good of regional peace, that needs to continue to be focused on the years to come.
Well, thank all of you for joining us this now afternoon. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. I think we've succeeded in not jeopardizing your job between now and the President's visit in a few weeks. And Dan, thank you very much for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.